I smiled when she said it, because at my age, you learn that arguing only wastes breath. You can sleep in the garage, my son's wife told me, as if she were offering a perfectly reasonable solution, like suggesting a different brand of tea. Her mother stood behind her, already hanging her coats in my bedroom, already deciding where her shoes would go. No one asked me anything. At 72, I had apparently become furniture that could be moved. The house smelled different that morning. Too much perfume, too much certainty. I stood in the doorway of what used to be my room and watched my life get folded into plastic bags. My son avoided my eyes, pretending to be busy with his phone, nodding along to whatever his wife was saying. He had that look men get when they've chosen peace over decency and are hoping it won't cost them much. The garage was cold and smelled of oil and dust. A narrow, folding bed leaned against the wall, as if someone had planned this in advance. I ran my hand along the hood of the old car and thought about how many years I had paid for everything in this house. How many nights I had lain awake worrying about bills so my son wouldn't have to. None of that mattered now. What mattered was that her mother needed space, and I did not. I carried my things myself. No one offered help, and I did not ask. A woman who has lived long enough knows when help is a performance, and when it is absent, because it was never meant to be there. I arranged my blanket, placed my shoes neatly by the wall, and sat down. The concrete was unforgiving, but it was honest. Through the thin door, I could hear them laughing, planning dinner, discussing curtains. My name did not come up once. That hurt more than the words had. Not the garage, not the humiliation, but the ease with which I was erased from the conversation of my own home. I did not cry. I have cried enough in my life to know when tears solve nothing. Instead, I sat very still and listened. I listened to my breathing, to the ticking of the old clock, to the calm that comes when something finally becomes clear. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a decision they had made without me. By evening, my smile was still in place. I thanked my son for making arrangements and wished his wife's mother a good night. They seemed relieved by my politeness, as if my silence proved they were right. I lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the dark ceiling, thinking not about where I was sleeping, but about what still belonged to me. I had spent a lifetime being agreeable. That night, in the garage of my own house, I stopped being confused. I began to pack. I woke up before dawn, not because I wanted to, but because the cold had crept into my bones. Concrete has no mercy, and at 72 you feel everything more clearly than you once did. My back protested as I sat up, the thin blanket already useless. For a moment I simply listened. The house was quiet, wrapped in that early morning stillness when people are still pretending their lives make sense. I washed my face at the utility sink, the water running too fast, too loud. In the mirror above it, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked old, I was used to that, but because there was something sharper in my eyes, less forgiving. I dried my face with a rag and folded it carefully, the way I always had. Order is a habit that survives disrespect. When I stepped inside the kitchen, my son's wife was already there, humming softly, slicing fruit as if this were a holiday morning. Her mother sat at the table wrapped in my robe, drinking coffee from my favorite mug. No one noticed me at first. I cleared my throat gently, not to announce myself, but out of habit. "Oh, you're up already," my daughter-in-law said, smiling in that thin, practiced way. "Did you sleep okay?" I told her yes. Not because it was true, but because explaining pain to people who don't care is exhausting." Her mother glanced at me, nodded once, and went back to her coffee. The robe stayed on her shoulders. My son finally looked up. "Mom, we'll figure something out," he said vaguely, as if time itself would solve this for him. I nodded again. I had spent years nodding at that tone. After breakfast, they left together, arm in arm, discussing errands, leaving the house behind them like a settled fact. I stood alone in the kitchen and looked around. My kitchen, or what used to be mine. The chairs were moved. The cupboard with my spices had been reorganized. My house was learning a new rhythm, one that did not include me. I went back to the garage and opened the old suitcase I hadn't used in years. It smelled faintly of cedar and dust. I placed my clothes inside slowly, deliberately, choosing what mattered and leaving the rest folded on a shelf. Not because I couldn't take it, but because I didn't need to. A woman who has survived as much as I have learns the difference between necessity and attachment. As I packed, memories came, not as sadness, but as inventory. This house had been paid for long before my son married. I had signed every paper myself. I remembered the day I first held the keys, the way my late husband squeezed my hand and said we were finally safe. Safe is a fragile word. It lasts only as long as people respect it. By afternoon, my suitcase was full. I sat on the folding bed again, resting my hands on my knees, and waited. Not for permission, not for an apology. I was waiting for the quiet certainty that comes when a decision has already been made inside you, long before you admit it out loud. When they returned that evening, I smiled as I always did. They talked over me, around me, about dinner plans and schedules. I listened politely. I was no longer part of the house, but the house was still very much mine. And for the first time since being sent to the garage, that thought warmed me more than any blanket could. By the third day, her mother had fully settled in. Some people arrive quietly, careful not to disturb what already exists. She was not one of those people. She moved through the house as if it had been waiting for her all along, opening drawers without asking, commenting on the dust in corners I had learned to live with, shifting furniture because it suited her back better. Each movement was confident, unquestioned. I watched it happen from a distance that was not physical, but final. She called my son by his first name, laughed too loudly at his jokes, corrected him when he spoke about things she thought he didn't understand. He listened to her. That was the part I noticed most. He listened in a way he had not listened to me for years, nodding, adjusting, eager to please. I recognized the look. It was the same one he had worn as a boy when he wanted approval more than truth. At lunch, she asked me how long I planned to rest in the garage. She said it kindly, like someone asking about the weather. I told her I was comfortable. She smiled, satisfied, and suggested I wear thicker socks. The matter was closed. Later, when my son stepped outside to take a call, she leaned toward me across the table. "You know how it is," she said quietly. "Young families need space. You've already lived your life." I did not answer right away. I looked at her hands instead, manicured, steady, resting on my table. Then I said, "I'm still living it." My voice did not rise. It did not shake. She looked surprised, then amused, as if I had made a small joke. She patted my hand once, indulgently, and stood up. That afternoon, I went through the house slowly, not to argue, not to reclaim, but to see it clearly one last time. The marks on the wall where my husband measured our son's height. The window I had replaced myself after a storm because money was tight and pride was cheaper than hiring help. Every corner held proof of effort, of time given freely. None of it was visible to them now. In the garage, I found a box I hadn't opened in years. Old documents, neatly tied with string. Deeds, insurance papers, receipts. I sat on the floor and went through them carefully, one by one, like a woman counting what she owns after a fire. Everything was in order. Everything was still mine. That evening, my son mentioned casually that his mother-in-law might stay a little longer than planned. He spoke quickly, as if speed could replace consent. I nodded again, smiled again. He relaxed immediately, grateful for my predictability. When night came, I lay awake, listening to the house breathe without me. I felt no panic, only a steady resolve forming, quiet and undeniable. They believed I was passive because I was calm. They believed silence meant agreement. They had mistaken patience for permission. On the fourth morning, my son finally asked to talk. He chose his moment carefully, catching me while I was pouring water from the kettle into my chipped blue mug, as if a familiar object might soften what he was about to say. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, eyes already tired. I knew that posture. It meant he wanted something settled without effort. "Mom," he began, lowering his voice, "we should probably discuss how things are going to work now." I waited. I had learned that silence makes people reveal more than questions ever do. He cleared his throat and gestured vaguely toward the hallway, toward my former bedroom. "You know, with Linda here, it's just more practical this way. She's older, she needs comfort. And you're adaptable." Adaptable. I tasted the word and let it pass. "Go on," I said. He exhaled, relieved I wasn't interrupting. "Maybe it's time to think about the future. Long-term arrangements. We could make things official. Put the house in both our names. That way everyone feels secure, and no one has to worry." There it was. Not shouted, not demanded. Offered like a favor. As if security were something he was giving me, not something I had built myself decades ago. I looked at him carefully then. Not as my son, but as a man standing in my kitchen, asking for ownership of what was not his. He did not look cruel. He looked convinced. Convinced that this was reasonable, fair, overdue. "And what would happen to me?" I asked. He frowned slightly, as if I'd missed the obvious. "You'd stay, of course. This is your home." He hesitated. "Just more structured. Less confusion." Less confusion. I thought of my clothes in a suitcase, my bed in the garage, my robe on another woman's shoulders. Structure, it seemed, had already been introduced. I had simply not been invited to help design it. "I'll think about it," I said. His shoulders relaxed instantly. He smiled, reached out, patted my arm. "That's all I'm asking." After he left the room, I sat at the table for a long time. The house hummed around me, busy and indifferent. I felt no anger. Anger requires surprise, and I was no longer surprised. What I felt instead was clarity. That afternoon, I drove into town alone. I parked in front of the small office with the familiar sign and climbed the steps slowly, my joints protesting, but my mind steady. The woman at the desk recognized me immediately. We exchanged pleasantries that meant nothing. Then she led me to a quiet room. I laid the papers out neatly, smoothing each one with care. The dates were clear. The signatures unmistakable. Ownership was not a matter of memory or emotion. It was written in ink. On the drive home, I rolled down the window and let the cold air touch my face. I felt strangely light, as if something heavy had finally settled into place where it belonged. That evening, as I returned to the garage, I did not feel displaced. I felt prepared. They believed the future was something to divide gently while I was still smiling. They did not yet understand that the future, like the house, was still entirely in my hands. By the 5th day, I had learned the new rules of the house without anyone stating them out loud. I was welcome as long as I was quiet, grateful, and invisible. I made my tea after everyone else had finished breakfast. I waited until the television was turned off before passing through the living room. I folded myself around their comfort the way I once folded my life around my son's needs, instinctively, without being asked. Linda's presence grew heavier with each hour. She spoke of doctors she preferred, of friends who might visit, of how much better the light was in my old bedroom for her joints and her sleep. She spoke as if permanence were already agreed upon. When she referred to the house, she called it the kids' place. Not once did she say my name in the same sentence. That afternoon, she decided the garage needed organizing. She stood in the doorway, hands on her hips, surveying my narrow bed and suitcase as if inspecting an inconvenience. "You shouldn't live like this," she said, almost gently. "At your age?" "At my age," I replied. "I've lived through worse." She laughed, uncertain whether I was joking. Then she suggested, lightly, that maybe I'd be more comfortable staying with a friend for a while, just until things settled. Things had already settled, just not in my favor. When my son came home, she repeated the idea in softer words. He listened, nodded, glanced at me with that familiar mix of guilt and relief. "It might be easier for everyone," he said. "Just temporary." Temporary has always been a dangerous word. It stretches when it wants to and snaps when it's no longer useful. "I'm fine," I said, and returned to the garage. That evening, I took out a small notebook I had kept for years, one I used to track expenses when money was tight. Old habits die slowly. I began writing again, not numbers this time, but observations. Who decided what? Who assumed what? Who spoke, and who stayed silent? Seeing it on paper stripped the situation of emotion. It became what it was, a quiet eviction dressed as concern. As night fell, I lay on the folding bed and listened to the muffled sounds of the house. Plates clinking, a shared joke, a door closing gently, confidently. I realized then that no apology was coming, no sudden awareness. They were comfortable. Comfort dulls conscience. I did not feel rage. I felt something steadier. Resolve, sharpened by age. When you are young, you fight to be included. When you are old, you decide what you will no longer tolerate. I closed the notebook and placed it back in the suitcase. Tomorrow, I would stop waiting for permission. On the 6th day, my son came into the garage without knocking. He stood there awkwardly, hands in his pockets, as if this were a temporary space and not the place where his mother slept. The light from the open door framed him in a way that made him look younger, uncertain. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked, already stepping inside. I nodded and sat down on the folding bed. I did not offer him a chair. If he wanted comfort, he could have brought it with him. He started carefully, the way people do when they're trying to sound reasonable. He spoke about stress, about adjustments, about how hard it was to balance everyone's needs. He said his wife was overwhelmed. He said her mother's health required stability. He said all the words that avoid the truth without quite lying. "You've always been strong," he said at last. "You don't need much. That's what I've always admired about you. There it was again. Strength used as an excuse. Endurance mistaken for consent. "And what do you need?" I asked. He hesitated, then sat on a crate opposite me. "I need this to work," he said. "I need peace in my house." "My house," I corrected quietly. He flinched just slightly. "Legally, sure," he said, forcing a small smile. "But you know what I mean." I did know what he meant. He meant ownership of atmosphere, of authority, of comfort. He meant that my presence disrupted the story he wanted to live inside. "You want me to leave?" I said. He looked relieved that I had said it for him. "Not leave," he corrected quickly. "Just not be in the way." I studied his face. I remembered it as a child's, smeared with dirt and tears, pressed against my shoulder when he was afraid of the dark. I had been his safety then. Now I was an obstacle. "I raised you to be honest," I said. "This is your chance." He swallowed. "Yes," he admitted. "I want things simpler." I nodded. No anger rose, no tears, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had already been true for days. "I understand," I said, and I meant it. He relaxed immediately, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. He thanked me. Actually thanked me, as though I were doing him a favor. Then he stood, patted my shoulder once, and left. After he was gone, I sat very still. This was the moment people talk about later, the one where they say everything changed. But nothing changed. It only became undeniable. That night, I took out the folder of documents again and placed it carefully at the top of my suitcase. I slept deeply for the first time since being sent to the garage. When morning came, I was no longer waiting to see how they would treat me. I was deciding how I would treat myself. On the 7th day, I woke before the sun and knew exactly what I was going to do. There was no drama in the decision, no trembling resolve. It felt the same way it had felt years ago when I signed the final papers after my husband died, when I chose not to sell the house despite everyone advising me to downsize. Calm, final, mine. I made my way inside quietly and brewed coffee the way I always had, strong and plain. Linda and my daughter-in-law were still asleep, their doors closed, the house resting around them like a promise they believed had already been fulfilled. I sat at the kitchen table and drank my coffee slowly, watching the light creep across the floor. This table had heard every important conversation of my adult life. It could hear one more. I did not confront anyone that morning. I did not announce anything. People mistake restraint for fear, but it is often just timing. I went back to the garage, dressed carefully, and drove into town just after 8. Traffic was light. The world moved at its usual pace, completely indifferent to the quiet ending of a chapter in my life. The real estate office was open early. A young man greeted me with professional warmth, offered me a chair, asked how he could help. I told him I wanted to list a house. I gave the address. He typed it in, raised his eyebrows slightly at the location, then nodded. "It's a good property," he said. "Should move quickly." "Yes," I replied. "I believe it will." We discussed details. Price. Timeline. I answered every question without hesitation. When he asked if anyone else lived in the house, I said yes. When he asked if they were aware of the sale, I said they would be. He didn't pry. He had seen enough families to know better. By noon, the paperwork was started. Nothing dramatic, just signatures and dates and the quiet satisfaction of doing something that could not be undone by raised voices or wounded pride. I walked out of the office lighter than I had felt in years. On the way home, I stopped at the bank. The woman behind the counter knew me by name. She always had. I made the necessary arrangements clear and precise. There was no rush in my movements, but no doubt either. When I was finished, she wished me a good day with a look that suggested she understood more than she asked. Back at the house, the atmosphere was different. I could feel it the moment I stepped inside. My daughter-in-law stood in the hallway with her arms crossed, confusion written across her face. Linda hovered behind her, lips pressed thin. "What's going on?" my son asked, emerging from the living room. "Why did a realtor call asking about showings?" I set my purse down gently and met his eyes. "Because the house is for sale." The silence that followed was heavy, stunned. They stared at me as if I had spoken a foreign language. "You can't do that," my daughter-in-law said finally. "We live here." "I know," I replied. "That's why I'm telling you." My son opened his mouth, closed it again. His face flushed, then hardened. "This is our home," he said. "No," I said calmly. "It's mine, and I'm done sleeping in the garage." No one spoke after that. There was nothing left to explain. I picked up my purse and went back to the garage, not as exile, but as a woman who had already reclaimed herself. The 8th day unfolded like a slow storm. No shouting, no slammed doors, just a tension so thick it pressed against the walls. My daughter-in-law stopped speaking to me entirely. Linda watched me as if I were unstable, dangerous in my quiet. My son paced, making calls, lowering his voice when he spoke, glancing toward the garage as if I might overhear something that still belonged to him. By mid-morning, the first realtor came by to take photographs. I walked through the house with her, pointing out details with the calm precision of someone who knows every inch by heart. Hardwood floors I had refinished myself. The new roof installed 10 years earlier. The garden that bloomed every spring without fail. I did not mention the garage. She did not ask. My daughter-in-law followed us from room to room, arms folded, lips tight. When the realtor stepped outside to photograph the yard, she turned on me at last. "You're doing this out of spite," she said, "because you don't like my mother." I looked at her carefully. "I'm doing this because I was told to sleep in the garage," I replied. "Spite has nothing to do with it." She scoffed, shaking her head. "You could have just talked to us." "I did," I said. "You just didn't listen." Linda joined us then, her voice sharp with disbelief. "You'd really sell the house out from under your own son?" I met her gaze evenly. "I raised my son to stand on his own feet," I said. "If he's ready to run a household, he's ready to find one." They both fell silent. There is something unsettling about an old woman who does not beg. That afternoon, the listing went live. My phone rang twice with unfamiliar numbers. Interest was already building. It was a good house in a good neighborhood, and the market did not care about family dynamics. My son confronted me again that evening. This time there was anger in his voice, raw and unfiltered. He accused me of betrayal, of overreacting, of destroying his marriage. I listened without interrupting, hands folded, waiting for the storm to pass. When he finished, breathless, I said, "You asked me to make things simpler. I have." He stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. "Where are we supposed to go?" he demanded. "That," I said gently, "is not my problem." That night, I slept without the blanket. I didn't need it. The garage felt temporary now, like a waiting room. I lay there thinking not of revenge, not of regret, but of how long I had been shrinking myself to fit other people's comfort. The house would sell, I was certain of it. And when it did, I would walk out the front door for the last time, not as someone pushed aside, but as someone who chose to leave on her own terms. By the 9th day, the house no longer pretended to be a home. It had turned into a waiting area, everyone suspended between anger and fear. My son barely slept. I could hear him pacing at night, opening and closing drawers, whispering arguments into his phone. My daughter-in-law cried loudly on purpose, the way people do when they want to be heard but not comforted. Linda criticized everything, as if blame could anchor her back into control. The first showing happened in the afternoon. I was asked to be absent, and I agreed without resistance. Not because I was ashamed, but because I had no desire to witness strangers admiring what my family had stopped respecting. I sat in my car at the far end of the street, hands folded on the steering wheel, watching people come and go through the windows that once framed my life. When I returned, the tension was sharper. My daughter-in-law accused me of embarrassing them in front of the realtor. Linda complained about the inconvenience. My son said nothing, which was worse. Silence had always been his way of retreating when reality demanded courage. That evening, he finally spoke again. "You've put us in an impossible position," he said, standing in the doorway of the garage. "We can't just move out overnight." "You didn't ask me to move overnight," I replied. "You asked me to disappear quietly." He flinched, but didn't deny it. The offers began coming in the next morning, one below asking, one close, one exactly where I'd hoped. The realtor sounded pleased, efficient. She told me the house was desirable, that the timing was perfect. I thanked her and said I would decide soon. When my son found out, he exploded. He shouted words I had never heard him use with me before. He accused me of choosing money over family, of punishing him for a small mistake. Linda joined in, calling me cold, heartless, ungrateful. My daughter-in-law watched, arms crossed, eyes bright with something close to triumph. This was the conflict she understood. I waited until they were finished. Then I said, "I was told to sleep in the garage. That was not a small mistake." The room went quiet. I continued, not louder, but clearer. "You did not ask how I felt. You did not ask if I agreed. You decided I was less important than your convenience. This is not punishment. This is consequence." They stared at me as if I had struck them, though I hadn't raised my voice once. That night, I accepted the offer. 2 weeks to close. 2 weeks to pack what remained of my life into boxes small enough to carry without help. For the first time since this began, I slept peacefully. The decision was no longer theoretical. It was written, signed, inevitable. And whatever anger still echoed through that house, it could no longer touch me. The 10th day was when they tried to break me with reason. Not anger, not shouting, but carefully chosen words meant to sound sensible, mature, unavoidable. My son sat me down at the kitchen table as if I were a child who needed things explained slowly. Linda stood nearby, arms folded. My daughter-in-law hovered, pretending to tidy while listening to every word. "We've talked," my son said. "All of us. This sale is extreme. You're acting out of hurt." I let him speak. "Hurt is an easy accusation. It requires no responsibility." "You're 72, Linda added, her voice sharp with what she believed was honesty. "This kind of stress isn't good for you. What you need is stability." My daughter-in-law finally joined in. If you go through with this, you'll ruin relationships you can't fix later. I looked at each of them in turn. They had gathered like a small council, united not by care, but by fear of losing control. Not once did anyone say, "Sorry." Not once did anyone ask me what I wanted. "I have stability," I said. "I have my mind, my health, and my name on that deed." My son rubbed his face, frustration seeping through the calm he was trying to maintain. "Where will you even go?" he asked. "You can't just start over." I smiled then, softly. "You'd be surprised what a woman can do when she stops carrying other people." That was when the tone changed. The kindness fell away. My daughter-in-law accused me of being selfish. Linda called me manipulative. My son said I was tearing the family apart. They threw words at me the way people do when they realize the old rules no longer apply. I stood up slowly, my joints stiff but steady. "You moved me into the garage," I said. "You made that decision together. Everything that followed belongs to you." That night, I packed the last of my things. Not because I had to, but because I was ready. I folded clothes carefully, wrapped photographs in towels, placed documents in a folder I kept close. Each item I chose felt deliberate, lighter than the last. I slept with the suitcase beside my bed, not out of fear, but out of readiness. The house was no longer mine in spirit, only on paper, and paper would soon catch up. They stopped talking to me after that. Silence returned, thick and awkward. But it no longer pressed on me. It slid past, unable to settle. The decision had already outgrown them. By the 11th day, the house was already half gone, not in walls or furniture, but in meaning. Boxes lined the hallway like quiet witnesses. My things were packed and labeled, neat and restrained, while theirs lay scattered in agitation, half-packed, half-abandoned, as if disorder might stop what was coming. The buyer's inspection was scheduled for the afternoon. I stayed in the garage, not because I was asked to, but because I preferred distance. From there, I could hear fragments of conversation drifting through the open door. Complaints, whispered arguments, the brittle politeness people adopt when strangers walk through their private failures. When the inspector arrived, my son knocked on the garage door for the first time since this all began. He hesitated before speaking, as if unsure what tone still worked with me. "They need access to everything," he said, "including this." I stood, smoothed my cardigan, and followed him inside. The inspector nodded at me politely, asked a few neutral questions, wrote notes. He treated me with more courtesy in 10 minutes than my family had shown me in days. That did not escape my notice. After they left, my daughter-in-law collapsed onto the couch, face buried in her hands. Linda stood rigid by the window, staring out as if the street itself had betrayed her. My son leaned against the counter, suddenly looking older than his years. "This didn't have to happen," he said quietly. "No," I agreed. "It didn't." That evening, the realtor called to confirm the timeline. Everything was on track. 2 weeks. I thanked her and ended the call. My voice was steady. I felt no triumph, only completion. Later, alone in the garage, I opened one last box. Inside were photographs I hadn't yet packed. My husband's smile, my son as a child, missing his front tooth, holding my hand. I looked at them without bitterness. Loving someone does not obligate you to accept being diminished by them. I placed the photos carefully into my suitcase and closed it. That night, the house was silent. No arguments, no tears. just the low hum of inevitability. I lay down on the folding bed and realized something quietly remarkable. I was not afraid, not of being alone, not of starting over, not even of losing my son, if that was what it took for him to finally see me clearly. The house would be sold. That was settled. What remained unsettled was whether they would ever understand that respect is not inherited. It is earned. By the 12th day, the anger had burned itself out and left something colder behind. Practical fear, the kind that wakes people early and makes them count money in their heads. My son stopped accusing me and started negotiating, which told me everything I needed to know. He approached me in the garage just after breakfast, holding 2 cups of coffee. He offered one to me carefully, like a peace offering. I took it, not because it changed anything, but because I am not rude. "We've been looking at rentals," he said, staring into his cup. "Everything is expensive. Short notice makes it worse." I nodded. The market does not care about hurt feelings. "We might need more time," he continued. "Maybe you could delay the closing, just a little." I sipped my coffee. It was weak. "The buyers have a schedule," I said. "So do I." He looked up then, irritation flickering. "You're really going through with this?" "Yes." He set his cup down harder than necessary. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to us?" I looked at him steadily. "Do you have any idea what sleeping in the garage did to me?" He fell silent. That question had no comfortable answer. Linda tried next. She cornered me in the kitchen later that day, her voice lower, more controlled. "You're forcing everyone into chaos," she said. "Families compromise." "I did," I replied, "for years." My daughter-in-law didn't speak to me at all. She packed boxes aggressively, slamming drawers, making phone calls filled with half-truths. I heard my name used often, always followed by sighs and pauses meant to invite sympathy. That afternoon, I went for a long walk. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had. Lawns trimmed, children riding bikes, people waving politely. No one knew that inside one of those houses, a woman had finally stopped being convenient. When I returned, there was a new urgency in the air. Movers had been discussed, storage units mentioned. Reality was setting in. That night, my son knocked on the garage door again. He looked smaller somehow. "Where will you go?" he asked quietly. "I've made arrangements," I said. "With who?" "With myself." He studied my face, searching for doubt. He did not find it. For the first time, I saw something shift in his eyes. Not remorse. Awareness. He was beginning to understand that this was not a tantrum, not a tactic. This was the end of an old arrangement he had taken for granted. I lay down that night with the garage door slightly open, letting in the cool air. The future no longer felt like a threat. It felt like space. By the 13th day, I no longer felt like a guest waiting to be dismissed. I felt like a woman in transition, which is a very different thing. The garage had become too small for my thoughts. I woke early, dressed carefully, and carried my suitcase to the car without asking for help. No one stopped me. No one offered to walk me out. That suited me fine. I drove to the small apartment I had rented across town, a quiet place on the 2nd floor with a narrow balcony and morning light in the kitchen. It wasn't grand. It wasn't meant to be. It was clean, orderly, and entirely mine. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence. Not the tense silence of a house full of resentment, but the honest kind. the kind that lets you breathe. I unpacked slowly. One box at a time, I placed my clothes in the closet, my books on the shelf, my photographs on the dresser. Each item found its place without resistance. Nothing argued with me here. Nothing demanded I shrink. When I made tea in my new kitchen, I realized my hands were steady. They had been steady for days now. That surprised me more than anything else. I had expected grief, maybe loneliness. What I felt instead was relief so quiet, it almost passed for peace. My son called in the afternoon. His voice was careful, restrained. He asked if I had arrived safely. I said yes. He paused, then said he hoped we could talk soon. Like a family. I told him we could when the time was right. Not today. He accepted that without argument, which told me the ground beneath him was still shifting. I sat on the balcony as the sun went down, watching the street below. People passing. Lives unfolding. No one knew me here, and that felt like a gift. I was not someone's inconvenience or obstacle. I was simply a woman at the end of a long day, drinking tea and watching the light change. That night, I slept in a real bed, not a luxurious one, but a proper one, with clean sheets and a window cracked open just enough to let in the night air. I slept deeply, without listening for footsteps or raised voices. When I woke, it was morning. The house would close soon. That chapter was finishing itself without me needing to watch. What mattered now was not what I had lost, but what I had finally refused to lose any longer. My dignity had followed me here, and this time, it wasn't going anywhere. By the 14th day, my son finally came to see me, not to argue, not to persuade, but because there was nothing left to negotiate. He stood outside my apartment door for a moment before knocking, as if unsure whether he still had the right. When I opened it, he looked around, taking in the modest space, the clean lines, the absence of anything familiar to him. This place had not been shaped around his comfort, and he felt it. We sat at the small kitchen table. I poured tea. He did not touch his cup at first. His hands rested on his knees, the way they used to when he was a boy waiting to be corrected. "The house closes in 3 days," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. He nodded, then hesitated. "I didn't think you'd actually leave. I didn't think you'd actually move me into a garage," I said, without sharpness. Just truth. He looked down, his jaw tightening. "We didn't mean it like that." "You did," I answered. "You just didn't want to hear it that way." There was a long pause. Outside, a car passed. Someone laughed on the street below. Life continued, uninterested in our reckoning. "I should have stopped it," he said at last. I should have said something. Yes, I agreed. That single word carried more weight than any lecture could have. He winced, as if struck. "I thought you'd understand," he said. "You always do." "I used to," I said. That was the problem. He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw something change. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but recognition. He was seeing me not as his safety net, not as background support, but as a woman who could walk away and survive. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "You don't fix it," I said gently. "You learn from it." We sat in silence after that. It was not comfortable, but it was honest. When he stood to leave, he hesitated, then said, "I'm sorry." I nodded. I did not reach for him. Some apologies arrive after the damage is done. They still matter, but they do not undo. When he left, I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, breathing deeply. I felt no triumph, only closure. That night, in my quiet apartment, I realized something I hadn't expected. Letting go had not made me smaller. It had finally allowed me to stand at my full height, even now, even at my age. The closing happened on a Tuesday morning. I did not attend. I had signed everything the day before, calmly, without ceremony. By the time the papers were filed, the house was no longer mine in any way that mattered. I made tea, watered the plant on my windowsill, and watched a patch of sunlight move across the floor. Life did not pause for loss or relief. It simply went on. My son sent a short message later that day. The sale was final. They were packing. He did not ask for help. That, at least, was progress. I wished him well and meant it. Wanting someone to grow up does not require you to carry them while they do it. In the afternoon, I walked to the small park near my building and sat on a bench with a book I didn't read. I watched people pass. A woman my age walked by with her groceries, steady and unhurried. A younger couple argued quietly, already learning the shape of compromise. Somewhere behind me, a child laughed. None of them knew what I had done. None of them needed to. I thought about the garage, about the cold floor, about how easily a lifetime of contribution can be dismissed when comfort demands it. I did not feel bitterness. I felt clarity. There is a difference. For years, I believed that being needed was the same as being loved. I was wrong. Being needed often means being used carefully, politely, until you no longer fit the plan. Love, real love, does not require you to disappear. That evening, I unpacked the last box. Inside was a framed photograph of myself at 40, standing in front of the house just after we bought it. I looked tired in the picture, but proud. I smiled at her, that younger woman, and placed the frame on the shelf. She had done her part. So had I. I am 72 years old. I have no illusions about time. But I know this much. Dignity does not age out. It does not expire. It does not belong to those who shout the loudest. It belongs to those who decide quietly that they will no longer accept less than they deserve. If this story felt familiar to you, if you recognized yourself somewhere between the garage and the front door, then remember this. It is never too late to choose yourself, even softly, even without applause.